Hi, I'm Jonathan M0JSX, and a few months ago, Icom UK were very kind in sending me an IC-7610 for review, and I'll be honest, this video has taken far longer to produce than I was intending, and my thanks to Icom UK for their understanding. But it means that I've had a lot of time to play with the 7610 and kind of use it as my daily radio, which has been a joy. So here is kind of my longer term thoughts, having used the 7610 for a few months, and where I think Icom could improve it. Although, as we'll find out later on, I'm scratching the bottom of the barrel, if I'm honest there. So let's just start with a brief overview. The IC-7610 was launched in around 2017. In fact, I first saw the radio at the Dayton Hamvention in 2017. When I was lucky enough to go with work at the time. Today it costs around £3,300, and depending on the dealer that you purchase from, you may get a free speaker or a free desktop microphone alongside the radio. But if you just want the headline figure, 329,995 seems to be the price that most dealers are charging for the 7610 nowadays. Also worth reminding you that the IC-7610 is a 100 watt base station radio with 2 receivers in it and that large screen. More on that in a moment. Unlike other flagships that you might find, the IC-7610 does require 12 volts, therefore it does need an external power supply, rated at around 30 amps. So let's talk about what I love about the IC-7610, and let's start off with the screen. It is huge, it is colourful, it is bright, and it is vibrant. And it just looks great. The viewing angles on the 7610 are fantastic, so even if you're looking at the radio a bit off axis, you can still clearly see the display. It's also nice to have the waterfall that I'm pretty used to from the IC-7300, but in a much larger format. And of course that monitor output on the back. Okay, it's a DVI connector, not an HDMI. Maybe on the next radio Icom could look at an HDMI connector. I don't know, although looking at the boards from the upcoming X60 prototype, that doesn't seem very likely. But even at DVI, it's still perfectly useful, and you can get quite cheaply a DVI to HDMI adapter. So whether you're going into a large external screen, or whether you're doing as I do, running that into a capture card, particularly for live streaming, it's a useful addition. It's a useful thing to have. I personally see it, if you're not into the kind of live streaming your amateur radio activities, and let's be honest, most people aren't, the use case where I can see that being most useful is if you're using the 7610 as maybe a club shack station, being able to put that screen up on a large television, so you know even people at the back of the room can see what frequency you're on. I think that's a great benefit. But even if you just want it in the shack as a larger screen, maybe you've got slightly poorer eyesight, it's a great feature. Moving on, the IC-7300, which I've used for a number of years, has always, I felt a bit limited by the fact that it's only had the one antenna socket. Of course, the IC-7610 does address that. Not only have you got 2 transmit and receive ports, you've got an extra dedicated receive antenna port, and also ports for things like a transverter, reference in, reference out, those kind of things available on the back. It's got more BNCs on the back of the radio than it does SO239s. In my case, I'm using those 2 antenna sockets because I've got my end-fed half wave for 83 to 10 meters on the one port, and then I've got a dedicated 10 meter flower pot on the second antenna port, and you can configure the radio that it knows which antenna to select per band. So let's just say maybe you've got a tri-band beam for, I don't know, 20, 15 and 10. Well, on the 20 meter band, the 15 meter band and the 10 meter band, you could have it select one antenna socket, and on every other band it selects the other, which is a really nice feature. I think that more radios should do that, and I'd like to see Icom possibly bring that down. It's just nice not having to worry about an external antenna switch, if I'm honest, which is the one thing I've always found quite limiting with the 7300, is that one antenna socket. But I understand that Icom have to save some things for the best radios. Another thing for the 7610 which puts a big tick against it is the physical buttons, and just the sheer number of physical buttons on the front of the radio, but not so many that I'm intimidated or scared by them. I think with radios such as the old Yaesu FTDX 5000, I always felt quite intimidated by the sheer number of buttons on the front panel, and I'm sure that if I was to use one every single day as a shack radio, I'd soon get used to it. But I like the sort of compromise the 7610 strikes between having, you know, dedicated band buttons, so swapping between bands is a one-touch process, unlike on the 7300 where you have to press and then press again. You can still do that on the 7610, but being able to have those physical buttons I think is fantastic. But nothing feels sort of over-complexed. No, you know, if something doesn't need to be on the front panel because it's not something you're going to be using regularly, well then it's just not, and you have to go into a menu in order to access it. But usually, even when you are going into a menu, it's usually only one button press away, so a big tick for that. And again, I don't know whether this is just me being somewhat of an Icom fanboy or whether it's just because I know the system so well. I find the menu system on the 7610 extremely easy to use. The next plus point for me is the Digi-Sel unit, which is something that Icom tends to put on the higher end radios. It really helps the performance of the radio in terms of rejecting out of band stuff, but it also enables me to use the noise reduction because it's rejecting out of band stuff much more efficiently, and I've really noticed a difference since I switched it on. It does mean that you can't use the preamp because it sort of bypasses the preamp circuit, but you don't necessarily need to. But what I tend to do for me on 40 meters, because I have got such a high noise floor, there's nothing I can do about it. I live in the middle of a town. It's just one of those things, is that I have the Digi-Sel unit engaged. I can also knock in some attenuation, which really does help me cope with the noise and lets the noise reduction system on the radio start to perform a little bit better than it would otherwise. And I have to say, the noise reduction system on the 7610 is not perhaps as good as found on other radios, like let's say the Yaesu FTDX 101 series, but the FTDX 101 series is later in terms of its release date. It was released at least 3 years later, so the noise reduction system had moved on by that point. But even on the 7610, I don't think it's poor by any stretch of the imagination. Next up is being able to plug the IC-7610 into a network Ethernet cable into your router and use the radio remotely. Now this, I'm a big fan of remote control. I think that being able to use your radio when you're not physically sat in front of it is a great plus. And I think Icom have really struck the balance well between the usability of the radio when you're sitting in front of it through the front panel, and also being able to take that experience with you when you're not with the radio. So the Icom RSBA1 version 2 software is excellent for remote controlling the radio. However, I find it a little bit limited in terms of being able to connect other software to it. So for instance, I went away a few weeks ago on holiday. I took my laptop with me. On a couple of occasions I found myself with a spare hour and a half in the afternoon to play radio from the apartment that we were staying in. So remoted into the 7610 using RSBA1, which works fantastically, but I wasn't then able to connect my logging software to RSBA1 for frequency stuff. So it's just little things like that. But in terms of what the radio does, it handled its side perfectly. And in fact, I've also used it with the SDR control app on both my iPhone and my iPad. And again, being able to just quickly make a QSO while I'm out and about from my phone is brilliant. I've got ham alerts set up with a number of call signs that I am watching and tracking and trying to work. And if I see a spot comes through that, I might be able to work that particular station right now on that band, I'll just fire up SDR control and see if I can hear them, and sure enough, a few minutes later I've made the QSO even when I'm walking down the street. Is fantastic. And that's all made possible because the IC-7610 has that server built into the radio, and it's not relying on something like a laptop or a computer plugged in over USB, as you would have to do with the 7300. It is, of course, worth noting that the IC-7610 is not the only radio that can do that. In fact, it's not the only radio that I've got here that can do that. The IC-705 would also have that functionality. The difference, though, of course, is that the 705 is reliant on Wi-Fi. Nothing particularly wrong with Wi-Fi, but when I'm coming to do something like this, where I don't want to have, I want to cut down on as much latency as possible, and I want to make sure that connection is top notch, nothing can beat actually plugging in a cable in my experience. So that's why I much prefer the Ethernet port available on the 7610 as opposed to doing on Wi-Fi on the 705. And of course the 7610 also has 100 watts to play with. So now we come to scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of what I don't necessarily like about the 7610 and where I think it could be improved. The first thing is something that Hayden recently touched upon in a video that he did, and it's the memory handling of repeaters. Now, I fully accept that if you're buying a 7610, you're possibly not going to be using it for talking into your local 6-meter repeater. I get that. But with us being sort of at the peak of the sunspot cycle and openings on 10 meters becoming a little bit more frequent, there's an argument to say that I would like to leave my sub VFO listening to a 10-meter repeater channel, possibly the one in New York, for any band openings on 10. And what the radio cannot do is be able to cope with the shift when you're using the sub VFO, because the way the radio wants to handle it is to have your receive frequency on one VFO and your transmit frequency on the other VFO. Now, in something like a 7610, that's not so bad because it's not a dual receiver, so it doesn't matter that both VFOs are being used because you're not noticing it. But what I would love to have seen on the 7610 is, let's say my sub VFO, I'm listening to a 10 meter repeater channel, I notice it come up, I want to quickly tap over onto that side and just key up, and it handle the shift and the tone and everything like that on that side of the radio. Meanwhile, my left VFO can still be listening on 40 meters. But the 7610 can't do that, and I don't know whether that's a limitation in firmware or in hardware, but I think that's somewhere where Icom could really improve that, would be to enable the shift on a repeater frequency, on a repeater channel, to stay within the VFO. I think that's a great shame that Icom haven't been able to implement that. Next up, I'm not a big CW person. I will openly admit that, and I don't know whether there's a particular reason why you might want your CW or your key socket, your keyer socket on the front of the radio. I don't know, but as someone who doesn't do CW but does have a key that is plugged in, I much prefer that to be on the rear panel. I don't know whether that's a particular choice to put it on the front or what the advantage would be to putting it on the front, but I don't like it. I'd much prefer the keyer socket to be on the rear of the radio. While we're talking about the rear of the radio, something I can't quite work out is why Icom have used a different accessory socket arrangement between the 7300 and the 7610. Now, I understand that historically, if you're coming from something like a 7600 or a 756 before it, having the two accessory sockets, one being an 8-pin and one being a 7-pin, that's what you're used to. On the 7300, Icom moved to using a 10-pin single accessory socket, which has all the same functionality that you find on the two sockets on the 7610. It was a bit of a shock then when I unplugged my 10-pin accessory socket on the back of my 7300 to plug it into the 7610 and found that doesn't fit, and quickly had to scrabble around making up a connector in order to use the same functionality, which in my case is simply taking audio out of that accessory socket for live streaming. Again, I realise that's a very me problem, but it meant I did have to sort of bodge that rather than being able to just unplug and plug in. So again, I wish Icom would just standardise on that 10-pin socket because they use it on the 7300, they use it on, I believe, the 9700 as well, certainly the 7100. I just wish that Icom would standardise that across the lineup rather than leaving the higher end radios on this 2 accessory port situation. There might be a reason for it, but I don't know. Finally, and this is something that I first thought when I first saw the 7610 back in Dayton, but the volume controls and the RF gain and squelch controls just feel a little bit loose compared to what we find on the 7300. On the 7300, it just feels a bit more premium, to be honest, whereas on the 7610, they just feel a little bit loose and, I don't want to say the word cheap, but yeah, cheap. Now, the only difference between the two knobs is that you can press the one on the 7610 to just mute that VFO. So I don't know whether that was a consideration in terms of they couldn't use exactly the same knob. Obviously, I'm guessing it is, but I just wish they'd have found one that was closer in the sort of smooth feeling rather than it being a little bit loose. But again, that's a really minor thing that I am scraping the bottom of the barrel in order to find. Overall, I absolutely love the IC-7610 and I am really going to miss it when it does go back to Icom UK, because I have so enjoyed using it over the last few months, and if I could, I would cling on to it. But alas, that's not a possibility and it does have to go back. Of course, you can get yours from pretty much any dealer in the UK, so they tend to be priced around the £3,300 mark. My thanks once again to Icom UK for lending me the radio. I have enjoyed using it and I'm really going to miss it. If you've liked this video, please do click on that like button. There's another button that seems to do just fine too. And if you haven't already done so, please do click on that subscribe button, as it really does help me out. There's another video coming up over here that the algorithm thinks that you might like next. Until next time, 73, bye bye.